By 1930, Joseph Stalin ruthlessly controlled the Soviet Union. But his policy of farm collectivization had led to famine. Millions were dying, and yet he exported grain to finance industrialization. Political opponents were murdered, torture was legalized, labor camps mushroomed, and the secret police executed countless victims. The famine and the terror. Stalin. Tonight at 10:45 on ITV.
This is Thames Television. Now, with the day's news, we join Alistair Burnett and Trevor MacDonald at the studios of ITN, with the time at 10 o'clock.
Taking few risks, the first televised budget is for savers. Smokers and spirits drinkers will be paying over the odds. Soccer clubs can improve their grounds with pools money. The murder witness who says the police told him to lie. And war canoes do liven up a royal visit. Good evening. The first televised budget was, the Chancellor said, for the less well-off and for savers, his kind of people. People who can put money away up to £9,000 over 5 years won't have to pay tax on the interest. People who aren't liable for tax can reclaim on interest on deposits in banks and building societies. Working mothers won't have to pay tax for the benefit of their firms running child nurseries. If football clubs agree, their grounds will benefit from a cut in the tax on the pools. People who smoke and drink spirits will pay over the odds, so will drivers not using unleaded petrol. But Mr. Major stuck to his present measures on the economy, only promising that interest rates will fall and growth will rise before the next election. He accepts that inflation could rise to 9% before falling to 5% next year. He's under big pressure tonight to make poll tax concessions retrospective in Scotland, where the tax has been going a year. Mr. Kinnock said it was a bits and pieces budget, a stopgap one.
The Chancellor was on his feet for an hour and 25 minutes. These were the main measures announced in Mr. Major's first budget.
On income tax, Mr. Major repeated the government's intention to move to a basic rate of 20 pence in the pound, but he did nothing this year. The basic rate stays at 25 pence, the higher rate at 40 pence. The threshold for paying the higher rate stays the same at £20,700. On personal allowances, that's the amount that can be earned before starting to pay tax, Mr. Major did no more than he's obliged to do by law, simply increasing them in line with inflation. The personal allowance rises by £220 to £3,005. The allowance available to a married man goes up £350 to £4,725. For pensioners, the personal allowance goes up £270 to £3,670, and the married age allowance up £430 to £5,815.
Excise duties, which last year were untouched, have gone up. Twopence and a pint of beer and 7 and a bottle of wine, both in line with inflation. Mr. Major hit spirits harder, up 54 pence more than 2% above inflation, and cigarettes up 10 pence on a packet of 20. The road tax disc stays at £100, unchanged for the 5th year. But he taxed the motorist by putting 11 pence on a gallon of leaded petrol and 9 pence on unleaded. The Green lobby wanted a smaller increase than that.
The Chancellor had other measures which he said made it a saver's budget. He's to abolish the composite rate on bank and building society deposits. Non-taxpayers will now no longer be taxed on their savings. He's introduced new tax-exempt special savings accounts in banks and building societies known as TESAs. They'll allow tax-free interest on up to £9,000 invested over a 5-year plan. He's to help people whose savings disqualify them from poll tax rebates. Savers can now have up to £16,000 before community charge rebates are lost. A concession to working women, they'll be able to get tax relief on workplace nurseries. Company cars will cost their drivers more. The car scales go up 20%. And Mr. Major, a Chelsea soccer supporter, is to cut the pool's betting duty on condition that the money lost to the Treasury goes to the Football Trust to improve ground safety and comfort.
Finally, how the budget affects business. The small company's corporation tax rate stays at 25%. That's in line with the basic rate of income tax. But the small company's ceiling is raised by £50,000 to £200,000. That's intended to help smaller growing companies. the main rate of corporation tax stays at 35%.
This is what the budget speech produced. A great waving of order papers, a burst of cheering on the Tory benches. It's something they didn't expect to be doing. Like the rest of us, they'd expected far tougher measures to fight inflation. However, for John Major, leaving earlier to present his first budget, I felt tense but not nervous, he confided later. The name of the game was indeed to use the contents of the famous red box to continue to squeeze out inflation, but not so drastically as to push the economy into recession.
The buoyancy of past demand means that inflation has been far more stubborn than anyone expected. A significant fall is still some months away, and a number of factors will mean that the position will worsen noticeably before it improves. I now expect that retail price index inflation may still be a little over 7% by the fourth quarter of this year, compared to the 5.75% I had previously expected.
But inflation would fall to below 5% sometime next year. Meantime, the principal weapon in the fight against it would still be high interest rates.
I know that high interest rates are unpopular. They are generally most unpopular as they become most effective. And my judgment is that interest rates will stay high for some time to come. The moment I judge I can safely lower them, I will. But to reduce them prematurely only to increase them again would be extremely damaging. When I bring them down, it will be because I believe they are likely to stay down.
But gradually the gloom began to lift. The Tory benches began to brighten as help for everyone from working mums to football clubs was announced. Mr. Major even joked about taxing lorries. And when the announcement that people would be allowed to keep more of their savings and still be able to claim housing benefit or poll tax rebates, there was joy on all sides.
The problem is most acute for those whose savings disqualify them from housing benefit and from community charge benefit.
That's a point Labour's been making for ages. They were pleased to have it recognised. The Chancellor went on.
I propose, therefore, to double the capital cut-off.
That had the Conservatives cheering too, realising that here was a further concession on the poll tax arrangements. The result of this basically neutral budget was that Mr. Kinnock couldn't find all that much in the Chancellor's actual words to criticise. Indeed, there was much to be thankful for, above all that the Chancellor had listened to Labour's suggestions.
Who knows? Who knows? Despite the preferences of the Prime Minister, we may have just a tiny corner of a listening government beginning. The unfortunate thing is, it's just too late to save them. He truly showed himself, in all these respects, to have the approach of a new broom. The problem is that that won't be terribly convincing for as long as the broomstick is ridden by the Prime Minister, and consequently...
Mr. Kinnock's attack was more on the whole economic record of the government and the desperate need there is for government and industry to work together, he said, above all on investment and training.
None of it will come from this government, none of it, certainly, will come from this budget. It will come from us. And from the sake of our country, the sooner the better.
And later the Liberal Democrats leader also said that Mr. Major hadn't tackled the really fundamental problems.
Mr. Major faced his first test, and I fear that he has sent out a boy's budget to do a man's job, simply not facing up to the real problems that Britain now faces. And I fear greatly that the city and those who invest in Britain will show their view of this budget very quickly, and it will be a negative view.
Tory high spirits, though, weren't simply a matter, as on every budget day, of Sir Nicholas Fairbairn's silly hat. Happiness, in short supply on the Tory backbenches recently, returned.
In my book, at any rate, he gets high marks for getting the overall judgment right. I think the economy is slowing down, and I think he was right to go for a broadly neutral budget.
But Labour returned to the wider economic picture.
Very gloomy economic picture. Clearly another year of mortgage misery and rising inflation. But perhaps most significant of all, the gloom about the economy. Output falling, investment down, trade deficit continuing high.
Now, among Tory MPs, there's not much expectation that anything said today is going to help save the Mid-Staffordshire by-election. Polling there is on Thursday. The judgment on this budget is going to come 6 or even 9 months from now to see whether what Mr. Major calls the distressingly slow fight against inflation has really begun to work. That in turn will determine whether Mrs. Thatcher can go to the country in the autumn, say, of next year, or whether she will have to wait until the spring or the summer of 1992. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
In the city, analysts are calling the budget neutral. Some were hoping for positive measures to help the pound and a firmer commitment on when Britain would join the European monetary system. Our business correspondent, Hugh Pym, reports.
The feeling of Conservative relief at Westminster was the exact opposite of the reaction in the city. Dealers and economists gathering to assess Mr. Major's first budget felt he'd given too much away.
We've been surprised by the fact that it's very much a political budget rather than one designed to give markets confidence. Chancellor's taking a risk.
The risk is that investors will feel that Mr. Major isn't doing enough to get to grips with inflation and will start selling the pound. The markets were expecting a harsh budget with tax increases. The price of government stocks fell sharply during the speech. Mr. Major forecast the trade deficit, £20 billion last year, will come down to £15 billion this year. Mr. Major said inflation will rise from its current level of 7.7% to what the city predicts will be 9.2% this summer. He says it'll be around 7 at the end of the year, but will fall below 5% in 1991.
I don't think it's going to come down to 7% by the end of the year. If he wanted that, he would have to have been a lot tighter in the budget. If he gets it below 8%, he'll be doing well. And certainly what he was saying about 5% inflation next year is very optimistic indeed.
Experts are impressed with the Chancellor's new measures on savings, intended to direct money away from spending on imports. He will abolish composite rate tax for savers at banks and building societies. This will help non-taxpayers, such as children and pensioners, who will get their interest tax-free.
There are 44 million savers with building societies, and 11 million of those don't pay tax. At the moment, they're having tax deductions on their savings, so it's very good news for elderly people, children, women, particularly those benefiting from independent taxation, and also the less well-off in general.
The other measures in the budget were very much to encourage savings, and many pensioners do save still when they are older, and so for all of those it's good news.
The Chancellor has also introduced an entirely new tax-exempt special savings account called Tessa. Interest will be tax-free on a maximum investment of £9,000 over 5 years, provided the capital is left in the account over the 5-year period.
I think it's the most interesting innovation we've had in the savings scene for a long time. The reason is that it's going to appeal to a far wider range of people than the previous one, the personal equity plan, which Mr. Lawson introduced.
Retailers are pleased that Mr. Major didn't do more to curb consumer spending.
The big fear today really was that he would further damage our efforts. He hasn't done that, so I think we've got to sit back and say, well, it was the best we could actually hope for in this climate of